if I recall, your question was, is it possible to see something doing two different computations without the observers being in a different time or place? And my conjecture was no.
Mhm.
And if I understand you correctly, you don't like that answer. And which, the truth of it is neither, well, it might become here or there, but it's neither here nor there right now. But what intrigues me about that is I'd like to know more about why that's not the right answer for you.
Got it. I I I don't like that answer, but I don't know that it's not true. It may very
Sure.
well be true that there cannot be two observers observing the results of two different computations where those computations are arising in the same place at the same time, and the two or more observers are also co-located in space and time. I guess I
Okay.
just wanted to drill down about whether that is possible or not. If they're going to make an observation of of these two results, and they're going to be in the same place at the same time, then it would seem that yes, the results themselves have to be in the same place at the same time. The only example I know of that so far with Atus's work is in the case of vibration, where the results are arising at two different frequencies at the same place at the same time. So, can an observer observe two different frequencies that are in the same place at the same time? And your answer last time, Richard, was no, because they need to be at different distances from the phenomenon, because vibrations are ultimately arising from rot rotations. Do I have that? I think I've garbled that.
Well, it's not, I guess I'm not so particularly attached to the why.
Okay.
I just make up the answer that feels right. It feels like the presence or absence of a particular computation or some other computation is only a perspective. Uh,
Okay.
and to have a different perspective requires you to be, I don't know, be a different thing or be the same thing in a different place or be
Right.
the same thing at a different time.
Yeah.
But you can't, my gut said you can't have two different perspectives without being different. But when you said it just now of if two computations can be in the same place and time, can two different observers be in the same place and time? No, I'm not so sure because that feels like that might be a neat little symmetry
Hmm.
that you know a capital A observes little a and capital B observes little b, and they co-create one another in their symmetry.
Right. And if observers can also be observations and vice versa, then the symmetry is more likely because if it holds in one and observers can be observations, then it's probably going to have to hold in the other. But I still can't see through to how, how would you construct, if this is true, what would be a simulation or what would this look like in biology where you'd have multiple observers in the same place at the same time? I don't know.
So here's I was trying to figure out what we really mean by same place and time, and I wonder if in biology, here's an example. Would you consider the two alters of a mildly dissociative, human cognitive system, right? So you've got two different personalities, same brain. I don't think you could say that they're just sitting in different parts of the brain. I don't think that's how it works. We could ask people, but I don't think that's it. And so they see the same event. One says, "Well, that's pretty normal," and the other one says, "Yeah, I'm the one who can tell this is abusive. This is not right. It looks normal to
Right.
you. I know it's not."
Right.
So, right. And so is it possible that the different place and time is not physical place and time? It's either it's, what's different about the perspective is the history that you've had or your cognitive architecture that enables you to see things different or something, but it's not because you're in a different place in time right now and physically having a different perspective on it. Your
Yeah.
perspective is it's different in some other space. Would that work?
I could imagine that same place if we consider one brain the same place. But and again, I don't know. But alters tend not to coexist at the same time, right? They turn on and then turn off again. Like you were
Well,
saying in this conversation, one says something and then one responds.
well, to clarify, what they do take turns in is in taking over the physical control of the physical body.
Uh-huh.
That doesn't mean that they're not on
Yeah,
non-verbally at the same time, where
got it.
whoever's in charge isn't aware of the other conversations. And in fact,
Mhm.
I've seen transcripts of conversations that the alters are having with each other, about how to go about getting control and this kind of stuff.
Interesting. Okay, yeah,
So I don't know, right? I mean, clearly the brain is not indivisible, and so you
right.
might argue that they're not actually in the same place and time. But I think we're getting close to being able to say that in the same medium, you could have in the same chunk of medium, you could have multiple. I mean, it's kind of what you were saying, that if we're going to say that patterns are observers, then you could have, like different frequency signals down the same coax wire.
Yeah, yeah, seems like a good place to start. But yeah, then can you boil this down not to brains which are divisible, but to things that are increasingly indivisible? How far could you push this phenomenon?
I mean, there's another notion of same place and time, which is hierarchy, right? So like, I don't know, in a cellular automaton system, you might have the glider might have a perspective, the individual cells might have a perspective. Are they in the same space and time? I mean, kind
Yeah,
of,
yeah,
but also not.
yeah. So this was going to take me into some ideas you were writing about this past week, Mike, about where is the agent? Is it in the Is it in the energetic pattern, or is it in the matter? So, thinking about these observers, in our case, thinking about granular metamaterials, and you have a vibrating particle. If that vibrating particle is vibrating at different frequencies, and those are according computations, there could be vibrations occurring at yet other frequencies that are damping or propagating one or two of those computational results on, and we could then treat that vibration at that other frequency as the observer. It's doing something with the result of that computation. So the only way I can think of multiple observers co-located in space and time is that they're energetic observers, they're vibrations. It's the minute you start thinking of the observer as made up of matter, or as a thing, then it feels very hard to think about multiple observers co-located in time. So
Yeah,
that,
you want relational processual observers, not substance observers.
exactly. And that would support Mike's thinking this past week that maybe agency is better attributed to energetic patterns than matter. Does that comport with what, or am I mischaracterizing what you said, Mike?
No, that's certainly part of it. But now I'm wondering, I don't know, maybe we need Chris or Don Hoffman or somebody, but do we have matter anymore? Meaning isn't everything supposed to be some sort of resonance of a I mean this, I don't know, but of a field or something.
Well, it's at least a vibration, if not completely made up.
It's pretty good.
If not entirely imagination. Um, I just want to float the contrary conjecture, just to dick with you. Uh, New conjecture: the only way to see two different computations in the same substrate at the same time is to have two different observers in the same substrate at the same time.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm also cognizant of the fact that when you're talking about computations that are done with vibrations, there's no such thing as a computation at an instant, right? There's no such thing as an output at an instant.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
like there's no such thing as a velocity at an instant.
Right.
Um, Nor is there conventional cognition at an instant, right? You're talking hundreds of milliseconds in order to say anything about the the human and his thinking.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the uh, hmm. Did you answer the question about why you wanted it that way, though, Josh?
Why I wanted it that way. It would be more interesting if it was that way, but of course, yeah, it's not up to us. Yeah, I think a lot of the work that we're doing and others are doing, just this traditional view of computation just seems increasingly wrong. And same thing with life and genetics and evolution is, we seem to keep stumbling over the fact that maybe we have it wrong. So I just keep coming back to the fact, well, how wrong do we have it? Maybe we should just, explicitly try and push in the opposite direction. Let's start with the postulate that observers are not distinct in space and time, and where does that go? And then, what else? Memory, agency, observers, computation, these other building blocks of our, assumptions about computation.
Yeah.
I mean, true, we can fall back on quantum effects and then things get weird, very easily. But, are things weird in a Newtonian sense also? We just haven't really thought properly about how weird it could actually be.
So I guess I can see one reason that I might like it to be true that two observers can be in the same place at the same time. That just because I like the symmetry of it. that
Okay.
that if that the idea of an observation or an observer being making an objective observation uh, might not make sense. That observation is always a computation. Observation is always a um, process over time. It's always involved and not just watching. Um,
Absolutely, right? So if we're assuming they're separated in space and time, then it's easier to say that's a result, that's a computation, that's an observation. But once that goes away, then yeah, it makes much more sense to conflate these things we thought were separate.
yeah. So one way to might might have to get some leverage on it would be to say, like Mike was saying, and what do you mean by it being in the same place at the same time?
Hmm.
Because um, if you had two observers that were in different places or different times, then
Yeah.
they couldn't even agree that the two computations that they were observing were in the same place or time because relative to me, it's in a different place than it is to you. So
Yeah,
we have
yeah.
to have some common frame of reference in order to agree that the computations we're looking at were in the same place and time.
True, true. Yeah, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and so this takes me into embodiment. Like, what's an action? How can an observer say, "Here, let me do something, and I'll prove that the result is coming from here at this time"? And the observer, it's not so easy anymore.
Yeah, right. So you can, so if you're doing two computations at different frequencies in the same substrate, you can change one of them independently of the other.
Hmm.
You can,
So a quote unquote observer could, modulate its amplitude or frequency or phase offset and muffle one of the two computations. Does like a knockout study. It says, I'm going to shut off the thing that I'm looking at, and that thing at that other frequency disappeared, and now I'm going to stop and it's going to come back on. could that action, however it goes about modulating amplitude and frequency to muffle, to create, negative interference, how, yeah, can actions be in the same place at the same time?
And now I'm bothered about who's observing the observers. Where's
Okay, here we go.
where's
Strap in.
the, where's the frame of reference that can make a judgment about whether or not these two observers are in the same place or time or not,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Infinite regress.
And
Imminent.
the only way to avoid the infinite regress is to say, well, the thing that you thought was doing the two different computations is the two complementary observations about the two observers.
Hmm.
And that way you have a closure on the frames of reference
Okay.
without, invoking another frame of reference outside it.
Hmm.
The same thing as making it closing the loop like Hofstadter style, making itself. Is that the same or different?
What the observer sees itself, or sees itself through an intermediate observer?
Well, the idea is that yes, it's all observer based, but you don't need others to tell you that you're real that's because either all of them or maybe it appears at some level, but some of them observe themselves. So the reason that you exist is not because you need anybody else to observe you. I mean, they do, and they make conclusions for themselves, but you can observe yourself, and that's it's a self lock. It locks you in place through a self referential
Yeah.
you know thing. I mean, I think that's what Doug was arguing.
Yeah, I don't know how that would work.
I mean, there are physical models of that kind of thing, right? There are knots and things that are,
Yeah.
that basically hold themselves together as a coherent.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's a way you could, I'll call it an observer. You have something operating at one frequency and it's generating patterns at other frequencies that are predictions of what it's going to do, or its actions. And then it matches it up. So it's the free energy principle. It
I mean,
says, I think this is about to happen to me, or this is what, it's predicting, it's retrodicting. There are patterns arising at different frequencies just before or just after patterns arose at some other frequency, and that's it demonstrating that it's observing itself. It knows what's about to happen.
that just sounds like reproduction to me. Patterns spawning off other patterns.
Yeah.
It is reproductions, and maybe they're hypotheses about the environment or about your own future states or something, but nevertheless.
Yeah.
Another question that comes to mind for me is, how separate do you want these two computations anyway?
Yeah.
So if you have two computations which are happening in two different frequencies, and those frequencies have the detector for frequency one cannot see frequency two at all,
Hmm.
right? Then that means that it's not in any harmonic ratio, however
Yeah.
abstract, obtuse, obscure that ratio might be, which means that it has to be an irrational ratio, right? That's the only way in which the two frequencies can't interfere with each other at all.
Hmm.
So that it really is a two-dimensional computation that's happening,
Interesting.
not
Yeah.
not two computations folded into one dimension.
Yeah.
But I think that we are actually interested in computations that do interact with each other most of the time, or at least share, that they're not completely orthogonal, that they do share some common frame of reference.
Why is that, Richard? Well, why is that more helpful?
Because otherwise it's just a bag of computations. And I'm interested in building systems out of subsystems which are doing multiple computations, but also interacting with each other.
Yeah. But
So
you're in the world and stuff comes at you independently on different modalities from the world.
yeah, and I need to do some sensor fusion with them, right?
Hmm.
Not just treat them as, because otherwise they are like they're ghosts that don't even haunt you, right?
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay.
The
We got
laziest
the
kind.
sound bite for this morning. There we go.
You know, they're just other computations going on that you have no contact with at all.
Yeah.
That's, I love that framing of it because I was just putting in that outline of the paper that we were talking about. I just put in this thing that the Jung said. People don't possess ideas; ideas possess people, right? And it's the same notion of a thought pattern that's looking for a substrate, and maybe it can sort of facilitate its own survival by either doing a little bit of niche construction in that substrate or yeah, maybe adjusting itself too as needed, but that kind of thing. So there are ghosts that haunt you and ones that don't,
Hmm.
or not much.
Yeah. If you and likewise, if you're ever going to do any comparison between, well, if we're two different observers observing different computations in this thing, if we ever want to do any comparison between, well, what did you observe? Well, what did you observe? You want to do any comparison there has to be something commensurate about that. You have to be able to talk the same language. There has to be a common, you have to be able to convert those observations into a common observation that facilitates comparison. And for truly orthogonal dimensions, you just can't do that. One is just not there to the other one. It's of measure zero. That's the thing I think, which is interesting about harmonic relationships, is their semi-independence. They're not. It's not a direct dependence. It's not like you know this one, you know everything about the other one.
Mhm.
But they're not entirely orthogonal either. And that's what gives it a, you know, the naive idea that you can only have one computation in a given place at a given time is like saying, um, we live on a number line and you can only be in one place at a time.
Mhm.
But if you live in a two-dimensional space, then you can represent two different numbers at the same time. But that's not what I wanted. What I wanted was something that was sort of two numbers, but sort of one number. It was sort of commensurate and sort of independent.
That's really interesting. I have a PhD student in my group who's doing some stuff with the computational metamaterials, and she's looking into logical independence. So, can you actually knock out one of the computations that's at the same place at the same time without harming the other one? And just naively, we've been trying to push to evolve, or optimize or train these materials to increase independence, but maybe that's not, I mean, it would be interesting to know just how independent can you make them, but maybe that's not ultimately useful.
Yeah,
Although in traditional electronics, that was the assumption, right? We want to shield computations and memories and storage from each other,
right. And then you bring them together when you're ready.
right? I mean, it's super hard to engineer something where everything, it's not modular. Everything's kind of affecting everything else.
Right. But that's the normal engineering way of doing things. It's like
Right, right.
I'm going to keep these things separate until I'm ready
Because that's all
because
we can handle. Yeah,
because I can't handle it otherwise, right?
yeah.
Whereas biology is exactly not that, because every frame of reference that's involved was co-created by the products of the processes that were happening within that frame of reference, and it all
Yeah.
disappears up its own orifice.
But also, you know, in that polycomputing paper that Josh and I did, we floated this idea that one one way that biology can use this is, so let's say you've got some complicated mechanism that you've evolved and you want to make changes and add new functionality. Well, as you start the traditional ways, when you start to make changes, it's going to screw up, you know, a lot of what you've done before, because there's all kinds of other systems depending on it to be what it used to be. But instead of that, if you can, instead of messing with the machinery, what if you instead, what if you proliferated observers? In other words, you came up, what you did was add a system that interprets what's going on in a different way. It doesn't need to change it and thus screw up everybody else's you know, operation, but it provides a new perspective on the existing stuff that's going on, and benefits that way. So you can make, you know, it's less destructive. You get to keep more gains if you do that, I think.
Yeah.
But I wonder, I mean, there's this, you know, whatever the Landauer, Bennett, all that stuff about like how much computation actually costs in terms of energy. And there's a limit, right? There's a limit per unit, you know, to space time and so on. And so this, you know, because it sounds like by proliferating these observers, it sounds like you can get more and more out of it. Is that, you know, are we breaking some sort of assumption that all those calculations did, or are we
Yeah,
gonna?
it would be fantastic to go back and revisit all that material, right? And
Yeah,
exactly, are we violating an assumption in there?
right. Either we're going beyond an assumption, which is completely fine, or that actually is going to end up being some sort of hard limit on how many observers you can, because it also doesn't seem necessarily true that there's an infinite amount of ways to see something as useful computation. Like maybe, but also it's pretty hard to see something that somebody gives you and, you know, say, I know how to see it as in a useful way. Like that's hard.
So I'm not sure about that. So I think that might be just limits of computation, limits of precision.
Mm.
That instead of giving you, so I could give you an incredibly intricate program with lots of nested loops in it, and you could fail to see the program as a whole and just see some of the nested loops or some particular subset of the nested loops. But I think that there's a space in which every program is just a number, and um, by recording that number with a finite precision, you're missing all of the programs that are in between the numbers. So it's a Gödel result, I suppose. But so it's a bit like saying how much of the information of a phenotype is in the environment and how much is in the genotype. And it's tempting to say, well, sure, you need to have the right kind of environment, but most of the information is in the genotype, right? But if you think of it as a sort of branching decision tree, where the environment presents a sequence of left rights as you go down that decision tree, then starting development at the right time or starting development at a different time would give you a completely different phenotype. Even though it feels like the architecture of the decision tree must have been in the genome, and all the environment was doing was just providing one variable at a time, as though it didn't have much information in it. But by changing the timing without changing the genome, you completely change the phenotype that you get, because you're changing the data that's flowing into the program, the sequence of data that's flowing in. And okay, so I feel the intuition that that you suggest, Mike, that well, we can't just have an infinite number of different computations going in there just because we have an infinite number of different ways of looking at it. But I'm not sure. In the limit, I think there really isn't any difference between a program and a number, and the precision of the number does give you different programs.
I really like this framing, Richard. Does it map onto the triple helix? The environment matters here. And I was thinking about this with the xenobots, is that the natural range of environments that brings forth wild type frog. We tend to think about that, well, I don't know, naively as a non-biologist, I think that is kind of a broad thing. Generally, frog DNA gives you frog, but that
Yeah,
range of
just
environments.
add pond, you'll be fine.
Right, exactly. But it's not, right? Because the pond is an ecosystem that's self-calibrating. Like maybe it is like this narrow range, this thing that draws out like your precision, like actual the set of environments that pushes frog DNA or frog bioelectric patterns into the wild type frog attractor is actually very narrow when you think about it. And there's a large number of other environments that push frog DNA and frog bioelectric patterns into other attractors. That like narrow range of environment is like this precision thing. I can poke at the frog genotype slash phenotype developmental program to get frog, but it's actually very precise. It's a precise number, so to speak. And once you step outside of it, other things start happening. But we're so used to thinking of the pond as sort of this wide range of things that it's so deep, it's so broad, it might as well be everything. Frog DNA, d just leads to frog. There's just one attractor. Maybe we had it wrong all this time.
Mm. Mm.
I mean,
I think the three of us are comfortable with thinking of, the attractor landscapes when it comes to organisms or species, but what is the range of environments? What does that landscape actually look like? Is wild type actually a very narrow, almost unstable, attractor or not?
I mean, I actually think we're looking at attractors in a whole other space here, in the sense that so you've got the genetics, of course, you've got the conventional environment that we're thinking about, but you also have got this again this like Platonic space of free lunches, rules, laws of mathematics and of computation and of geometry and all this other stuff that isn't really, you sort of can't pin it on either one of those things. I mean, you could call it part of the environment, but it isn't the physical environment, you know.
Right. Right.
It's right. It's all this stuff about like if you look at any of these mechanisms and you keep saying, but why is it that way? Eventually you get down to math, and eventually you get down to just laws of truths of, I don't know, number theory or category theory or something. And then I don't know, I guess that's in the environment, but not in any conventional sense.
Yeah.
So if you imagine, if you start from an assumption that there's a symmetry between the amount of information on the inside and the amount of information on the outside, and that's somehow in balance between the frog and the pond, then one might ask, well, where is the information held in the pond, and where is the information, how did it get there, right? So if you think about it as how has the pond been conditioned by the lineage of frog? That there's all sorts of, I mean, just the sheer improbability of frog working, like of that being like, why the fuck should that work, right? Not just that, how do you get a frog from a genotype, but now that you've produced a frog, how is that going to be a thing that's going to work out there in the world, right? It does need quite a lot of things to be just so about the world in order for frog to be to survive. But the fact that the ecosystem that the frog is being born into has been conditioned by the lineage of frog that came before it has pushed information into the environment in a way that makes it just right for frog. And if it weren't, it wouldn't be able to draw frog out of frog genotype.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's very interesting. That makes me wonder what that situation is like with respect to the Platonic space as well. Is it, because I tend to think it's bidirectional in the same way that it's bidirectional with the environment. Like And another way of asking that is there an anthropic principle with respect to the rules of mathematics? So people say, oh, if the conditions of the physical universe were like a tiny bit different, there wouldn't be any ponds, there wouldn't be any, any matter, whatever. What about, I don't know, it's obviously beyond beyond what I know about, but is there a situation like that with respect to some of these mathematical truths that make the whole thing hang together? Like, is there some kind of improbable collection of parameters that make all that hold together, or that's really an attractor that you can't get out of? It's like it always just works.
I think it all follows, all of that Platonic space and all of that maths all follows from imagine an entity looking at itself in a mirror. That if you can get that far, everything else follows. But there's already quite a lot going on in being able to, imagine an entity, it's looking at its own reflection, it sees it somehow. I don't know what the fuck all of that means. But once you've got that separation between a thing and a reflection of a thing that's the same in every way except in one respect, right, that it's reflected through the mirror plane. And now you've got things like, well, there's the set of all things on this side and the set of all things on that side, and the things that are everything on this side has the property of being on the other side from everything that's on that side, but everything's on this side has the property of being on the same side as everything else that's on this side. And now you've got things like the mirror image of a function, like if and only if, being the mirror image being XOR. And then you say, well, are those two functions the same or are they different from each other? You don't know, they're completely different from each other. But they're not completely different from each other, because actually they're the exact symmetry of each other. That one of them, they're the only two functions which are non-linearly separable over two variables, and one of them is the complement of the other. They know a lot about each other. They're equal in every respect except for the sign. And all of that sort of nested levels of sameness and differentness, I think everything comes from that. And that comes as soon as an entity looks at itself in a mirror. As soon as you make some separation between a thing and a non-thing, and then you're making a comparison between them, it's like, are they the same thing flipped around, or are they different things? As soon as you do that, all of the rest of the maths and all of the rest of the geometry, truth, computation, and everything else follows. Bit of a leap, maybe.
Okay, but you need a particular kind of universe to get to the point where you can have an organism that can look in the mirror and see itself, because of course that's a pretty long loop to go out and come back to and say, ah, that's me over there, or that's me.
Yeah.
To me, it seems you need a universe in which that going out and coming back, the recognition that that is me, or the Hofstadter loop, you need a universe in which there's a gradient that leads up to that, right? Because that can't come up de novo. So again, I can imagine, there's an observer that's sitting at frequency f plus epsilon and is looking at another frequency at f very close by, and whenever it manages to increase its amplitude, however it does, this thing right next door in space and time does the same thing. So presumably that's going on all the time in very simple living systems. So it's not hard to quote unquote look at yourself in the mirror there, and then in the course of development you hold on to that loop, but the loop itself gets bigger. It's never open and you have to struggle to close it. It's always closed. But that requires a certain universe in which frequencies that are very close and frequencies that are at irrational numbers from one another are independent. You need all those things to establish the fact that there is a gradient that points you eventually, if evolution does enough work, up to primates that can look in a mirror and still see themselves. They're still able to travel that longer loop.
Yeah.
I could imagine another universe where that's not true, right? And then forget about it. It's not gonna happen.
Mike asked me this question about resonators that I hit one tuning fork and it makes another tuning fork resonate. It puts power into it. How come when I damp the second tuning fork, it doesn't take power out of the first one?
Ooh.
Right? How come that isn't reversible? And I think that it is. I think that the power that you have to put into the first tuning fork to ring it requires that it isn't damped. And when it isn't damped, that's the same thing as saying its power gets reflected back to itself so that it doesn't just dissipate away. So when you have two tuning forks that mirror each other, that's actually the same as creating a mirror plane between them, so that the one tuning fork thinks it's just looking at its own reflection. And if you were to take the second tuning fork away, then the energy that was coming out of the first tuning fork wouldn't have a mirror plane, and it would just dissipate away from it. It wouldn't be bounced back to itself. So I think that those issues of, you know, seeing your own reflection and stuff, I take them down to quite a low level.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't need I'm not thinking about an agent with eyes and awareness and a mind to think about it. Just an ongoing, some sort of ongoing physical process that is ongoing, or it isn't ongoing. It's ongoing, or it's damped or dissipated or something like that. And that's that kind of in order for it to be ongoing, there's a certain kind of closure or reflection that protects it from dissipation to the outside, which is the same as saying that the outside is mirroring it, which is why it looks like a reflection plane.
Is this is a super basal version of that when let's say photons interfere with themselves in a slow to double, you know, slit experiment, right? When you send one photon through at a time, is that like a basic failure to pass the mirror test? Is that
So it interferes with an alternate path it could have taken, which is the pilot wave explanation. The movement of the electron is creating a wave which propagates through the other slit that it then interferes with on the other side.
it's like yeah, it's like if
its own alter.
yeah. So you got a camera facing this way and another camera facing this way. You'll recognize immediately that this one's you. You may not immediately recognize that that one's you, right? Who it was? Who had that? There was a Bohm or somebody had actually a picture of this, like a fish and then two, you know, two cameras from two directions, and the one is incredibly obvious, but the other one is like, wait, is that the same creature? Or like, is that me or isn't it? So I wonder if under normal circumstances, what happens in the macroscopic world is that everything sort of recognizes, oh yeah, that's all me. I'm gonna sort of we're gonna collapse it all into one coherent action. But by setting up these double slit things, we're breaking that, and we're catching it at times where it's not sure that that's itself, and it sort of interferes with it the way that you might think that it would interfere with something else.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm an electron going through one slit, or an electron going through two slits, but the other slit's very far away, then Do I feel like a newborn on the other side of the slit? No, because my own waves propagated in front of me as well, and they're still there on the other side of the slit, aren't they? That's what causes me to diffract.
I mean, that kind of fan out maybe is what it takes to break the normal cohesion and integrate and non-interference. That once you've done that, you've sort of, it's like you've punctured that self world boundary, and so now you're not quite sure, these other things. It's like, it's like when you see, when the dog like scratches himself with his foot, and then it like bites the leg, like who's touching me, that kind of thing, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
So
So
go ahead,
the
Richard.
electron has got a bit of brain damage when it comes through the other side of the slit, right? It doesn't really know which way it was going anymore. It's bent by its own pilot wave, but not because of the pilot wave that made it through the slit, but because of the loss of the wave that didn't make it through the slit. It doesn't know its own trajectory anymore. And when it sees the pilot wave, the other part of its pilot wave that went through the other slit, that's like reacting to its own alter, like you say, with the dog biting its own leg.
and it's nice that and again, I don't really know anything about this stuff, but it's nice that that's the place where observers really became strongly into physics, right? Is that okay? So what does the electron see, and what do we see watching it? What does the electron see? What's the, I wonder what the, yeah, there has to be, we gotta get Chris on this, because there has to be a macroscopic version of this, like in cognitive space, when and it'll be something about the, it'll be something about the Markov blankets or something, but this is where that phase and the Markov blanket stuff could maybe come together. I feel like
Yeah. So there is you don't need quantum effects to see the double slit experiment because you can do it with the water droplets.
right.
So it's not quantum stuff that produces that effect.
I bet we could come up with a polycomputing materials vibrating version of this.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
Nice.
That would be fun.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you can do just like the double slit thing. You can do that with like that's already been done with, waves and whatever. But I'm saying specifically from the perspective of an observer, right?
Right.
What's the
So
integration agent? Yeah.
so the so the two slits are like two different observers, and the interference between them reflects the fact that the two computations weren't really independent in the first place.
That's interesting.
Mhm.
I mean, that certainly, right. Wow, that completely fits into this to the quantum weirdness that shows up when something is observed, right? So again, you have this, you don't have non-destructive reads, and this idea that as soon as you've added an observer, now everything's different, right? Things change depending on whether, I mean, I think that's a common result in that field, where when you actually observe something, that changes what happens.
So
So
if the observation is a resonance between a bidirectional resonance between you and the computation, not just a one-way thing, then that would mean that in order for me to observe something through one of the slits, I will alter the computation which is being observed through the other slit. So it will appear that the two observations are not independent.
I think there's really something here. I think with a with a materials polycomputing stuff, we could formalize the notion of an observer and their interpretation feeding back on how how another observer is seeing what's going on.
Right. Yeah.
So if you put the two slits, if instead of shooting it at a wall with two slits in it, you had a circular wall around the source and the two slits were 90 degrees apart, then presumably the component of the wave that gets through one of the slits doesn't interfere with the component of the wave that gets through the other slit. I'm sure there's lots of reasons why you can't do that, but
well, but here's where here's where the wave particle thing makes a difference, right? Because if you think you're shooting photons, then they won't. If you've got a radio wave antenna in the middle, then it will, because it goes everywhere, right?
yeah.
And then I don't know what happens after that.
Yeah.
So if you're at relatively low frequencies, then you do go everywhere. Does that matter? When people make, I wonder, when people make radio transmitters, the fact that it automatically goes in all the directions and, you know, refracts and gets held up by various stuff, and does that screw up anybody else's ability to receive? I don't think so, right? Or is it just too small for anybody to notice?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how that works.
It's interesting that thing that when you shoot a signal down an optic fiber, it gets degraded when the fiber is bent because the reflections on one side are not going the same distance as the reflections on the other. But when you do it in that graded density fiber, so instead of just being a glass fiber that's the same density all the way across, and then it reflects off the inside walls, you have a glass fiber that has a graded density, so that instead of reflecting off the outside walls, it reflects internally, and then they don't do that distortion. So it's not just bouncing off the walls, but the amount of it automatically compensates for how much curvature there is and how much deflection there is and how much time distortion there is, in such a way that that problem just goes away. It feels to me like the difference between the reversibility of the hydrodynamic models, you know, the bouncing water droplet. Did you see that, Josh? So the bouncing water droplet stuff, if you have a droplet that's moving around and its trajectory, you know, its trajectory has sensitive dependence, it's a chaotic trajectory.
Okay.
And then you're keeping the droplet bounce going by vibrating the bath underneath, right? But if you skip a beat in the bath underneath so that it lands on the back of the wave instead of the front of the wave, then the droplet reverses its direction. So that instead of walking along this way, it walks back that way, right? Even though all you did was like, and then you skip the beat in that half a beat in the vibration. But the chaotic trajectory of the path that the droplet has gone through also reverses. It's chaotic but reversible, which chaos shouldn't be.
Right.
That instead of, you know, now you're going the other way, but that's also chaotic, and so it's still divergent. No, it doesn't. It goes back to the point where it started.
Wow, interesting.
And that works in the hydrodynamic realm, but it wouldn't work if you think about chaos as discrete events and responses.
So which of all these physical phenomenon is responsible for eventually being able to develop the concept of self and other, the dog that bites its leg? Like what is the smallest change what's the universe prime that's one epsilon over, where evolution can't get going, it can't establish self and others and reproduction and
I mean,
everything is self, right? It's just you can't get enough distance.
well, I was talking to Chris one day, and I asked him what would it take to make a universe in which there were no least action laws, no active inference? Like how could you get rid? Because that starts, with his and Carl's framework, it starts very low down. And so I said, how would you get rid of that? And he said the only way to do that is a universe in which nothing ever happens. So if you had a completely fixed universe, but as soon as you allow change, that's it. After that, you're off to the races.
And nothing happens, or nothing particular happens at a particular point in time.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't ask that. I didn't ask that.
I mean, okay, but it seems like a little bit of an easy out. Like maybe there's a universe in which stuff does happen, but there was a slightly different result obtained from the double slit experiment. This wave particle duality is not quite dual, or it's biased towards one or the other, or and then it can't happen. You are able to always retain your history. There's never a separation in time. Things never diverge from one another.
Yeah,
I don't know. Physics is over my head, but
right. Yeah, me too. But my gut feeling is that kind of a thing is there's gonna be an anthropic principle here too, where
mm,
where yeah, all of that stuff could have been screwed up, except everything is balanced just right so that it's not. That
right.
that's my
Right.
gut feeling. Although you know what, just thinking back to my crazy question about the anthropic principle in math, maybe it did fall apart, which is why we have Gödel and those things that tell you like maybe that's exactly what happened there, is that it did not manage to land on the consistent and complete. Uh,
Mm.
we live in a universe where the anthropic principle
Cracks.
failed. What's that?
A universe with cracks.
The Platonic space failed the anthropic selection filter, and it does have cracks, and it looks to us like the Gödel and completeness results, and maybe Turing limits and things like that as well. But the physical part seems to, or okay, here's what I bet. I don't know, maybe Bernardo would say something like this, that we imagine, from an idealist perspective, we imagine the universe as nice and tidy because we have to, because it's our approximation of a failed deeper reality, but we've kind of made a nice little neat vision
Yeah,
for
you can only see the tidy parts. That's all.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Why does it look like everything balances out? Because otherwise it'd be too upsetting. That's why.
To the extent that I'm a tidy thing, I can only see tidy things.
Hmm.
Well, I would say it's like, Mike's cognitive frame rate, right? The cracks are all here, but luckily in this universe, they're small enough or that I can skip over them in my cognitive frame rate. It's relatively easy to ignore them. They're in me too, but again, I tend to feel that I'm observing at the level of the organism rather than at the level of the subatomic particles that I'm made up of. And if my comfortable frame of reference was the subatomic plane, then I wouldn't be able to, hold on to this. Maybe that's why, the subjective experience tends to feel to us at a higher level, because at this high level, you can comfortably not see the small cracks that are down at the lower levels. The agents that are down there, and there are agents that are down there, they can't get away with the illusion that things are neat and tidy.
Mm.
All right.
So
It's an unsettling thought, right? They're there and they're aware and they're suffering like hell. They can't make predictions. They
yeah,
can't, you know.
that's not bad. So basically the drive, yeah. So the drive for complex for cognitive complexity and the ability to coarse grain is a anti-stress response, right? That it's basically, let's get the hell out of this. I can see reality. It's horrible. Let's get out. Let's develop a confabulatory world building capacity as quickly as we can, because it's really upsetting down there. Something like that.
I mean, that's right. Like prey evolved to be big, so they don't have to worry about predators. Like maybe this is like a cognitive version of that kind of thing. You can escape by just being bigger.
Because I like it because like literally to be have a size you need energy, and time and energy become limiting pressures, and that means you have to coarse grain. That forces you to coarse grain. You don't have time to track microstates. You have to know coarse grain, and that means you now have to tell fake stories to yourself about the world and yourself, right? So you have to come up with these compressed models that abstract from all the upsetting details at the bottom,
Yeah.
something like that.
Don't you think that being an agent in a world that doesn't make sense is the same as not being an agent? To the
Yes.
extent that you can't be a tidy thing in an environment that doesn't make
Well,
sense to you.
I mean, Richard, you're the expert endosymbiosis, right? So I might be an agent way down at the lower levels, and I still need to like survive and reproduce, but I can't predict. I can't, there's a lot of things I can't do. So I'm going to try and lean on agency being developed at a higher level of organization that does whatever I need it to do. I mean, I could just, yeah, go away, but maybe there are things down there, are agents down there, but they're relying, they're parasites on us to do the things that they can't do in their messy world.
They're agents. They exist as agents to the extent that they are able to find an environment that makes sense to them.
That, maybe they can't push against the physical world directly because they can't predict how it's going to push back, but they can push on us, and then we push in the Newtonian space and get reliable repercussions and somehow communicate that back down to them. Maybe we are a crutch for them. Us big things are sitting on this Newtonian island in the sea of, quantum effects, and they're in the sea. They can't get out, but they can influence us a little bit. Maybe it's the best they can do.
But it's probably calming or nice or something to be part of a big system that feels like it knows what the hell's going on,
Yeah.
and is part of and has this reasonable model of what's happening.
But yeah, I wonder if there's a testable hypothesis here. Like Richard could be right. Like you just can't be an agent down there. You get snuffed out somehow, or not. Can you, survive barely, but hanging on by hanging on to bigger, slower things?
Well, I'm just suggesting it by symmetry that the that, that the entity is only coherent to the extent that it is a mirror with a coherent environment.
Hmm.
So I just can't be a coherent entity in an incoherent environment. That's like an oxymoron.
Yeah, right. But if the host, the big slow host, is 99% of my environment, and I hold on to 1% of direct contact with the messy, painful stuff down here, okay. It doesn't have to be a black and white thing. I don't have to give up.
Right. So then the thing that's coherent is the upward visibility of the host.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And so and in if that's a mirror too, then the host is only coherent to the extent that the parts make sense.
I mean that's in biology, asking like how to model it or whatever. Isn't that what the biology is doing? So at the level of the molecules, it's extremely noisy. Any given molecule comes and goes. Even cells come and go. But the ship of Theseus of the body kind of persists for some amount of time. So yeah, if you track the lower level stuff, it's pandemonium, and everything dies and gets denatured and excreted and whatever. But on the large scale, you can sort of hold on to a coherent story for a while.
Right.
And as Josh said, you don't lose the contact entirely. So your retina can sense individual photons, or at least some retinas can, and maybe there's some other quantum biology going on somewhere. So you have a little bit of that still going on, but overall, you've pretty much gotten out of that by
Mhm.
by raising the level to the point where you're not tracking microstates anymore.
Mm.
It's sort of, it's, I can't see it, I can't see it anymore, you know.
we'd still have to spec out like a benefit for staying in direct physical contact with the things at your level of organization. Like if we're going to say there's an agent down there, there's got to be something that benefits the agent down there. Otherwise, yeah, why wouldn't it just completely give up? I don't know what that would be, but